The air in the big room felt heavy, like a wet blanket. It wasn't just hot. It was thick with nerves. You could smell it, a mix of expensive cologne, fear, and the faint, dusty scent of old velvet seats. This was the final day of auditions for the city's most famous orchestra, and only one spot was open. Every person in the waiting area looked like they had been carved from the same perfect piece of wood. They were young, their backs ramrod straight, their faces a mask of calm that didn't quite hide the panic in their eyes. Their instruments, whether a violin, a flute, or a trumpet, gleamed under the soft lights like they had never been touched by a human hand. They all came from the best music schools, with resumes that listed every competition they had ever won. They were the best of the best, and they all knew it, which somehow made it even worse. A young man holding a violin kept wiping his sweaty palms on his perfectly pressed black trousers. A woman with a harp stared at a single spot on the wall, her lips moving silently as if praying to the notes she was about to play. They were all so polished, so perfect, it was almost boring. On a small table at the front of the room sat a panel of 3 judges, but all eyes were on the woman in the middle. She was the director, a legend known for her sharp ear and even sharper temper. Her name was spoken in whispers in music schools, a story told to scare young musicians into practicing. She had a look that could make you feel 2 inches tall, and she wasn't afraid to use it. She had already sent 5 people home that morning with just a shake of her head, not even a word. She was looking for something more than just perfect notes. She was looking for magic, and so far she hadn't found it. Then the door at the back of the hall creaked open. Every head turned, and the tension in the room shifted. It wasn't one of the scheduled candidates. It was an old man. He shuffled in, not with the confidence of a performer, but with the slow, careful steps of someone who felt every creak in his bones. He was in his late 60s, maybe older, with a face that was a road map of a long life. His suit was a faded brown, a bit too big in the shoulders and a little too short in the arms. It looked clean, but it also looked like it had seen better days a long, long time ago. On his feet were scuffed leather shoes that had been polished until they couldn't shine anymore. In his hand he carried a shallow case, but it wasn't like the sleek, black fiberglass cases the others had. This one was old and covered in scratches, and a long strip of silver duct tape held one corner together. It looked less like a case for a precious instrument and more like a toolbox belonging to a kindly grandfather. A low murmur went through the room. The young musicians looked at each other, their eyes wide with a mix of confusion and disbelief. Was this a joke? Was he a janitor who had gotten lost? The old man didn't seem to notice the stares. He just kept walking toward the single, lonely chair that sat in the center of the stage under the brightest spotlight. His shoes made soft, shuffling sounds on the polished wooden floor, the only sound in the suddenly quiet hall. He moved with a strange kind of dignity, his focus entirely on the chair. As if it were a destination he had been walking towards his whole life. As he climbed the 3 small steps to the stage. A young man with a perfectly coiffed hair let out a snort, which he quickly tried to cover up as a cough. A few others saw it, and a smirk spread across their faces. It was the kind of laughter that comes from a place of superiority, a shared moment of "this is ridiculous." When the old man finally reached the chair and sat down, the old wood let out a loud groan. That was it. That broke the dam. A ripple of real, audible giggles spread through the room. It wasn't mean, not really. It was just the absurdity of it all. This old man in his rumpled suit with his beat-up cello case, sitting in the same spot where the country's most talented musicians had just been trembling with fear. It was like a clown walking into a funeral. The director, Isabella, had been leaning back in her chair, looking bored. But when the laughter started, her head snapped up. Her eyes, dark and sharp as flint, scanned the room. The giggles died instantly, smothered by her glare. She was not amused. She had seen people try all sorts of tricks to get noticed. They wore crazy outfits, they played their instruments behind their backs, they did anything to stand out. She thought this was just another one of those stunts, a desperate play for attention. She looked at the old man, her expression a mixture of annoyance and impatience. She was ready to dismiss him, to wave her hand and say next without even hearing a single note. He was wasting her time, and everyone else's, but the old man on stage didn't seem to hear the laughter, or if he did, he didn't care. He was busy. He carefully placed his worn case beside his chair and opened the two tarnished metal latches. He lifted out his cello, an instrument that was just as old and scarred as its case. It didn't gleam. It had a soft, warm glow, like a well-loved piece of furniture. He held it with a gentleness that was surprising, his gnarled, arthritic fingers caressing the wood as if it were the most precious thing in the world. He took a small piece of cloth from his pocket and wiped the body of the cello, not for the judges, but for himself. It was a ritual, a moment of connection between him and his old friend. He then took out his bow, tightening the horsehair with the same slow, deliberate movements. The room was silent now, watching him. The young musicians weren't smirking anymore. They were just watching, fascinated by this strange, quiet man who seemed to exist in his own world, a world that had nothing to do with auditions or judges or fancy suits. He finally looked up, not at the director, but at the music stand in front of him. He arranged his sheet music, his fingers trembling slightly as he straightened the edges. He took a deep breath, his chest rising and falling slowly. The director watched him, her pen tapping impatiently on her notepad, her face set in a hard line. She had already made up her mind. The old man's fingers, though twisted and swollen with age, moved with a quiet purpose over the strings of his cello. They weren't the fingers of a virtuoso, long and elegant. They were the hands of a man who had worked with them his entire life, hands that knew the texture of wood, the cold of steel, and the weight of a heavy tool. But they also knew every curve and groove of this instrument. To him it wasn't just wood and catgut. It was a living thing, an old friend who held all his secrets. He ran the bow gently across the block of rosin, the dry, scratchy sound the only noise in the vast, silent hall. The young musicians watched, their initial amusement replaced by a kind of confused fascination. They had never seen anyone prepare an instrument with such reverence. It was less like a setup for a performance and more like a quiet, personal conversation. The director, Isabella, watched him too, her pen now still on her notepad. Her impatience was still there, a tight knot in her chest, but it was mixed with something else. She couldn't quite put her finger on it. She had seen thousands of auditions in her long career. She could tell within the first 10 seconds if a player had the goods. She looked for posture, for the way a musician held themselves, for the confidence in their hands. This man had none of that. His back was still stooped, his suit was still rumpled. But there was a stillness about him now, a focus that seemed to push the rest of the world away. He wasn't looking at the judges, trying to impress them. He wasn't looking at the other musicians, sizing up the competition. His eyes were closed, his head tilted slightly as if he were listening to a melody only he could hear. He was thinking of his father. A big, burly man with calloused hands that could split a log in two but could also coax the most beautiful sounds from this very cello. His father hadn't been a professional either. He was a dock worker who played in smoky bars on weekends to make extra money. He taught his son to play not for fame or for a career, but because it was a way to speak when words weren't enough. This cello, his father used to say, his voice a low rumble, it's got a voice. You just have to learn how to listen to it, and then you can tell it what to say. The old man remembered sitting on a small stool in their tiny living room, the smell of his mother's cooking filling the air, while his father taught him how to hold the bow, how to feel the vibration of the strings through the wood and into his own bones. He also thought of his wife, Eleanor. She had loved his playing. She said it was the sound of his heart, made into music. He remembered playing for her on their first date, a nervous, fumbling attempt at a simple folk song. He remembered playing for her in the hospital, when the sickness had taken her voice and left her weak. He played for her then, not the sad songs everyone expected, but the joyful ones, the ones that reminded her of dancing in their kitchen on a rainy Sunday afternoon. He promised her on her last day that he would never let the music die. This audition, this crazy, impossible idea, wasn't for the director or for a spot in some fancy orchestra. It was for her. It was to keep a promise. A young woman in the front row, a flutist with a resume that made her parents weep with pride, found herself watching the old man's hands. She had spent her entire life chasing perfection. Every note had to be flawless, every breath perfectly timed. Her life was a series of metronome clicks, a constant race against an impossible standard. But looking at this man, she saw something different. He wasn't chasing perfection. He seemed to be searching for something else, something deeper. The way his fingers, stiff with arthritis, still found their place on the fingerboard with such certainty. It was a kind of knowing that couldn't be taught in a classroom. It was a knowing that only came from time, from living, from loving and losing. For the first time all day, she felt a pang of doubt, not about him, but about herself. Isabella, the director, felt it too. She was a master of technique. She could spot a flaw in intonation from 100 feet away. She had built her orchestra on precision, on a flawless, powerful sound. But as she watched the old man, she remembered something her own mentor, a grizzled old conductor from the old world, had once told her. "Bella," he had said, "you can teach a monkey to play the right notes, but you can't teach it to make you cry." She had spent so many years focusing on the notes, she wondered if she had forgotten about the music. She looked at the old man's cello, so scarred and imperfect. It had a story just like its owner. Her own pristine instrument, locked in its case in her office, was perfect. It was also silent. The old man finally opened his eyes. He looked down at the sheet music on the stand, but he didn't really see it. He knew this piece, the Bach cello suite, not from endless practice in a practice room, but from a lifetime of playing it for himself. He played it when he was happy, when he was sad, when he missed his father, when he ached for his wife. The notes were not just notes to him. They were landmarks on a map of his life. He took a deep, slow breath, and the room seemed to hold its breath with him. The silence was no longer just quiet. It was heavy, thick with anticipation. The director leaned forward ever so slightly, her critical expression softening into one of intense curiosity. The young musicians forgot about their own auditions, their own anxieties. They were just people in a room waiting for a story to be told. The old man adjusted the cello against his shoulder, its familiar weight a comfort. He lifted his bow, and for a moment, he wasn't an old man in a rumpled suit in a fancy hall. He was just a man with his cello, ready to speak the language he knew best. The air crackled with a strange energy, a sense that something impossible was about to happen. The old man lifted the bow, and for a moment, it seemed to hang in the air like a question. The room was so quiet you could have heard a pin drop, but it was more than that. It was a quiet that had weight, a quiet that pressed in on everyone, waiting. Then he drew the bow across the strings. The sound that filled the hall was not what anyone expected. It wasn't the clean, clear, perfect note they had been hearing all day from the other candidates. It was a sound that seemed to come from the very earth itself. It was raw and a little rough around the edges, with a texture like old, worn wood. There was a slight rasp to it, a tiny crackle of imperfection, but within that imperfection was a universe of feeling. It was the sound of a lifetime, not just a single moment. It was so deep and so full of character that it seemed to bypass the ears and go straight to the heart. The effect was instantaneous. The young man who had been smirking earlier now sat with his mouth slightly open, his face a blank canvas of shock. The flutist in the front row felt a sudden, unexpected tightness in her chest. The pen that the director, Isabella, had been holding slipped from her fingers and fell onto her notepad with a soft tap. She didn't even notice. Her entire world had shrunk to the sound coming from that old, scarred cello. All her training, all her years of listening for the slightest error in pitch or timing, vanished. In that single, imperfect note, she heard something she hadn't heard in a very long time. Truth, he began to play the required piece, the famous Bach suite. But he didn't play it the way it was written in the books. He'd played it like he was telling a story. The opening notes were not just notes. They were an introduction, a quiet hello to an old friend. As he moved into the melody, his eyes were closed, his face a landscape of emotions. When the music swelled, it wasn't just loud. It was a wave of joy that seemed to lift the very air in the room. It was the sound of his wife, Eleanor, laughing in their sun-drenched kitchen on a Sunday morning. You could almost see her, her head thrown back, her eyes sparkling. The high, dancing notes were her footsteps as she twirled around the room, pulling him into a dance with no music but the beating of their own hearts. The young musicians watched, completely mesmerized. They had spent their lives in practice rooms, trying to make every note perfect, every rhythm exact. They saw music as a mountain to be conquered, a series of technical challenges to be overcome. But this man wasn't conquering anything. He was surrendering to the music. He was letting it flow through him, carrying all his memories, all his love, and all his pain. The flutist looked down at her own silver flute, so perfect and shiny. It suddenly felt cold and lifeless in her hands. She realized she had been so focused on playing the right notes that she had forgotten how to make music. This man, with his old cello and his stooped shoulders, was showing her a world she never knew existed. A world where the mistakes were just as important as the perfection. Where the story was more important than the technique, the music then shifted, becoming deeper, more somber. The notes were slower, heavier, filled with a profound sadness that seemed to settle over the room like a gentle rain. It was the sound of loss, of saying goodbye. It was the feeling of sitting by a hospital bed, holding a hand that was growing cold, trying to pour a lifetime of love into a few final moments. A few of the younger musicians in the audience felt their own eyes well up with tears, not for the old man's story, which they didn't even know, but for their own. The music was a key, unlocking doors in their hearts they had kept shut for a long time. It reminded them of their own heartbreaks, their own goodbyes. It was a universal language, spoken with a local accent. Isabella, the director, was utterly transfixed. Her mind, a finely tuned instrument of its own, was racing. She could hear the technical imperfections. The vibrato was a little unsteady, the bowing not always perfectly smooth. By all the rules she had lived by all the standards she had used to build her career, this performance was flawed. It was messy. It was undisciplined. And yet, it was the most beautiful thing she had ever heard. She remembered being a little girl, hearing her grandfather play the accordion in his small, smoky apartment. He wasn't a professional. He played with sloppy fingers and a leaky bellows, but his music made her feel safe and happy. She had spent the last 30 years trying to erase that memory, to replace it with the cold, perfect beauty of classical music. She had told herself that emotion was a crutch for the technically weak. But listening to this old man, she realized she had been wrong. So terribly wrong. The perfection she had been chasing was a cage, and this man's music was the key to the door. She wasn't just listening to a cello anymore. She was listening to a human soul, laid bare for all to see. The old man played on, lost in his own world. He wasn't aware of the stunned silence of the room or the tears on the cheeks of strangers. He was back in time, walking with his father along the docks at sunset, the sound of the seagulls mixing with the melody his father hummed. He was sitting on the porch with Eleanor, watching the fireflies dance in the twilight as he played a soft, simple tune. The cello was his time machine, and every note was a ticket to a cherished memory. His body swayed gently with the music, not because he was performing, but because the music was moving him from the inside out. He and the cello were one entity, breathing together, feeling together, telling one long, beautiful, heartbreaking story. He reached a particularly difficult and fast-paced section of the suite, a flurry of notes that usually sounded like a display of technical skill. In his hands, it didn't sound like a display. It sounded like a storm. It was the chaos of a life lived fully, the rush of emotions, the tangled web of joy and sorrow that makes us human. The notes tumbled over each other, not in a messy way, but in a way that felt perfectly natural, like raindrops on a tin roof. It was exhilarating and terrifying all at once. When the storm passed and the music returned to its simple, opening melody, the feeling was one of profound peace. It was the feeling of the sun coming out after a storm, the feeling of coming home. He played the final few notes, each one a soft, gentle sigh, and then he let the bow rest on the strings. The last note hung in the air, shimmering and fragile, before it slowly faded into silence. And in that silence no one moved. No one breathed. They just sat there, held in the grip of a story they would never forget. The last note didn't just end. It dissolved into the air, leaving a space that felt bigger and emptier than before. It was a silence so complete it seemed to have a sound of its own, a low, humming stillness that vibrated in everyone's ears. No one moved. No one dared to breathe. It was as if the old man had poured all the air out of the room and replaced it with his story, and now they were all living inside it. The young musicians, who had been so full of competitive fire just an hour ago, now sat as if they were made of stone. Their instruments, once symbols of their ambition, now rested in their laps like forgotten toys. They were no longer rivals. They were fellow travelers, all having been taken on the same journey by a man they had laughed at. The flutist in the front row stared at her own hands. They were trembling. She had practiced for 10,000 hours to have perfect control, to make her fingers do exactly what she wanted when she wanted. But now they felt foreign to her. She looked at the old, gnarled fingers of the man on stage and understood. His fingers weren't just playing notes. They were touching memories. They were caressing the cheek of a lost love. They were wiping away a tear. They were holding the hand of a dying father. Her own perfect, unblemished hands had never done anything but practice. A wave of something like sadness washed over her, a longing for a life she had never lived. She realized with a jolt that she had been so busy learning to play the flute. She had forgotten how to feel the music. The young man who had snorted earlier felt his face burn with shame. He remembered the look of contempt on his face, the smug feeling of superiority. Now he felt small. He felt like a child who had just been taught a lesson he didn't even know he needed. He had always thought music was about being the best, about playing faster and higher than anyone else. He had wanted to win, to prove to everyone, to prove to himself that he was special. But the man on stage hadn't been trying to prove anything. He had just been sharing. And in his sharing, he had shown everyone in that room what it truly meant to be special. It wasn't about perfection. It was about truth. The young man slumped in his seat, the fight gone out of him, replaced by a quiet, humbling awe. The director, Isabella, felt like she was drowning. The old man's music had pulled her under into a deep, dark ocean of her own memories. She saw her own father, a stern man who never praised her, but who would secretly listen to her practice through the door, a look of pride on his face she was never meant to see. She remembered her first love, a clumsy, heartbreaking affair that ended in tears and a promise to never be that vulnerable again. She had built a fortress around her heart, brick by brick, with each success, each flawless performance, each critical review. She had become the director, the untouchable, the perfect. But this man's music had torn down her fortress with a single, imperfect note. It had found the scared little girl inside her, the girl who just wanted to make beautiful sounds. Her mind, a library of musical rules and regulations, was in chaos. The pages were flying. This performance broke every rule. The intonation was questionable in places. The rhythm was fluid, almost sloppy in its freedom. By the strict standards she had used to build her world-renowned orchestra, this was a failure. It was undisciplined. It was amateurish. And yet, it was the most profound, the most moving, the most correct thing she had ever heard. She had spent her life searching for a musician who could play with perfect precision, and she had found many. But she had forgotten what she was really searching for, a musician who could make her feel. And here he was, an old man in a rumpled suit with a beat-up cello, who had just made her feel more alive than she had in decades. On the stage, the old man slowly opened his eyes. He looked a little dazed, as if he had just woken from a long dream. He took a deep, shuddering breath as if he had been holding it the entire time. He wasn't looking for applause. He wasn't looking for approval. He was just a man who had finished telling a story. He carefully lowered his bow, his hand trembling with exhaustion. He looked down at his cello, a faint, sad smile on his lips. He had done it. He had kept his promise to Eleanor. He had let her music live one more time. He seemed completely unaware of the spell he had cast over the room, of the lives he had just changed. To him, it was just another conversation with an old friend. He began to pack up his cello, his movements slow and deliberate. He wiped the strings with his soft cloth, lovingly, as if tucking a child into bed. He loosened the bow and carefully placed it back in the case. He then lifted the cello itself and settled it into its worn, scarred home. The sound of the latches clicking shut was the first sound to break the profound silence. It was a soft, final sound like the closing of a book. As he fastened the worn leather straps around the case, a few people in the audience let out a breath they didn't know they were holding. The spell was beginning to break. The other two judges on the panel looked at the director, their faces a mixture of confusion and awe. They were waiting for her cue. They had never seen her like this. She was always in control, always decisive. But now she just sat there, her face a mask of conflicting emotions. They had no idea what to do. They had heard what everyone else had heard, but they didn't have the authority to act on it. Only she did. Finally, the director moved. It was a small movement at first, just a straightening of her back. But it was enough to draw the attention of the entire room. Every eye was on her. She pushed her chair back, the legs scraping softly against the floor. The sound was loud in the quiet hall. She stood up slowly, as if she were testing her own strength. Her face was no longer a mask of a critical judge. It was softer, more open. Her eyes, which had been so sharp and hard earlier, now glistened with unshed tears. She didn't look at her fellow judges. She didn't look at the other musicians. Her gaze was fixed on the old man, who was now struggling to his feet, his cello case in his hand, ready to shuffle back out of the world he had briefly, so beautifully inhabited. The old man had his hand on the worn handle of his cello case, ready to turn and make the long walk back to the door. He thought it was over. He had done what he came to do. He had played his heart out for Eleanor one last time in a place that mattered. He expected nothing, not even a thank you. In his mind, the polite, cold dismissal from the director was a foregone conclusion. He was just a strange interruption in a very important day, a brief, odd moment that would soon be forgotten. He started to shuffle his feet, preparing to descend the 3 small steps from the stage and disappear back into the city, from which he came, but he didn't get to take that step. A sound broke the heavy silence. It was the scrape of a chair leg against the polished wood floor. It was a sharp, loud noise in the stillness, and it made everyone jump. The old man stopped, his hand still on his case, and turned his head. The director, Isabella, was on her feet. She wasn't just standing. She was moving. She walked out from behind the long table where the judges sat, leaving her 2 colleagues looking stunned and uncertain. She walked toward the stage, her steps slow but deliberate. Each footfall echoed in the silent hall, a steady, determined beat. The young musicians watched her, their breath held tight in their chests. They had never seen her like this. She wasn't the intimidating queen of the orchestra anymore. She looked like a pilgrim walking toward a sacred shrine. As she walked, her eyes never left the old man. Her face was an open book, its pages filled with a story of its own. The hardness was gone, replaced by a softness that was almost heartbreaking. The lines around her eyes seemed deeper, not from age, but from the weight of a sudden, overwhelming emotion. She reached the edge of the stage and looked up at him, a small, frail figure standing in the bright spotlight. For a moment, she didn't say anything. She just looked at him, and he looked back at her, his expression a mixture of confusion and apprehension. He thought she was going to scold him for wasting everyone's time. The other musicians in the room were frozen. They were witnessing something that felt private, something they weren't supposed to see. The young man who had smirked felt a lump form in his throat. He saw the director, the woman he feared more than anyone, looking up at the old man he had mocked with an expression of pure, unguarded respect. In that moment, he understood. He understood that the contest he thought he was in had ended before it even began. He had been playing a game of notes. While the old man had been speaking the language of the soul, Isabella finally found her voice. It was softer than anyone had ever heard it, barely a whisper, but it carried through the silent hall with the force of a shout. "Wait," she said. The old man stopped completely, his body tense, waiting for the verdict. She took a deep breath, as if the words she was about to say were physically difficult to get out. "I have been in this hall for 3 days," she began, her eyes still locked on his. "I have listened to the best young musicians in the country. I have heard perfection. I have heard technique that would make the angels weep with envy, but I haven't felt anything." She paused, her gaze dropping for a second to the empty cello case at his feet, then back to his face. "For 30 years I have been building an orchestra of flawless machines. Every note in its place, every sound perfect and clean. I thought that was what greatness was. I thought that was what people wanted to hear." A small, sad smile touched her lips. "You just reminded me that I was wrong. You just reminded me that music isn't about perfection. It's about the cracks. It's about the imperfections. It's about the story behind the notes." The old man just stood there, bewildered. He didn't know how to respond. He had just been playing his cello, the way he always did. He didn't understand the profound effect it had on everyone. To him, it was just a conversation with an old friend. He opened his mouth to say something, to apologize maybe for taking up so much time, but no words came out. Isabella took another step closer, her hands resting on the edge of the stage. She looked up at him, her eyes shining with tears she refused to let fall. She wasn't the director anymore. She was just a person who had been touched by something beautiful. She looked at his stooped shoulders, at his kind, tired face, at the hands that had just torn her world apart and put it back together in a new, more beautiful way. And she asked the question that had been burning in her soul since the first note he played, "Where have you been all my life?" It wasn't a question that needed an answer. It was a statement. It was a confession. It was the sound of a woman realizing she had been searching for a treasure her whole life, only to find it in the one place she never thought to look. The question hung in the air, heavy with meaning, with years of searching, with a lifetime of missed connections. The old man finally understood. He saw the look in her eyes, and he realized it wasn't pity or contempt. It was gratitude. It was reverence. A slow, shy smile spread across his face, a smile that seemed to light up his whole being. He didn't have an answer for her question. How could he? He had just been living his life. He had been working and loving and losing and remembering. He had been here all along. He simply shrugged his shoulders, a small, humble gesture. "I've just been around," he said, his voice quiet and raspy. Isabella nodded, a single tear finally escaping and tracing a path down her cheek. She wiped it away quickly. "Well," she said, her voice a little stronger now, filled with a new sense of purpose. "The position is yours, if you'll have us." A murmur went through the room, but it wasn't a murmur of shock or jealousy. It was a murmur of agreement, of acceptance. The young musicians knew, without a doubt, that it was the right decision. It was the only decision. The flutist looked at her own flute, then back at the old man, and a genuine smile graced her lips for the first time all day. She had learned more in the last 10 minutes than she had in 10 years of practice. The old man looked out at the sea of faces, at the young people who had laughed at him, at the director who had been ready to dismiss him. He saw their faces now, full of respect and wonder. He looked down at his old, beat-up cello case, the one he had carried for so many years, the one that held so many memories. He thought of Eleanor and how much she would have loved this. He thought of his father and the simple lessons he had taught him about music and life. He gave a small nod to the director. "Okay," he said. "Okay." And with that, the audition was over. But for everyone in that room, the lesson had just begun. Isabella stood there for a long time after the old man had left, watching the empty chair on the stage. The silence that filled the hall was no longer empty. It was full. It was full of the echo of a story, full of the sound of a lifetime, full of the quiet, humbling power of a single, imperfect note.